20, correct? The Secretary will read the bill.
In the Senate, Senate Bill 1220 by State Affairs Committee, an act relating to the Terrorist Control Act to revise the legislative purpose, to remove...
Mr. President,
Senator Anton.
I ask unanimous consent that further reading of Senate Bill 1220 be dispensed with, that the journal show it's been read section by section, the third time at length, and placed before the Senate for final consideration.
Without objection, Senator Anton, you're recognized to open the debate on Senate Bill 1220.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Every once in a while on the Senate floor, there's deja vu. This is year 3 that you have seen this language before you. I don't know if it's a violation of the rules or not for me to tell you that every year we've passed this, but we have. And senators, it's also kind of a funny thing. I've noticed that every year there's a piece of legislation that I'm familiar with. And I read a newspaper article about it and I say, wait, what piece of legislation is this newspaper article about? And then you realize, oh, they're talking about my bill. you go, they haven't even read this bill to understand, or maybe I haven't done a good job telling people what it is or what it does. But certainly I think that is the case with Senate Bill 1220. And so I hope today, senators, as you consider it, and I ask for your vote, that I do a good job in explaining what the intentions are, what I think the ramifications are, and what the bill actually says and does. The bill, senators, is about fundamental constitutional rights. I'll name a couple that I think pertain here. One is due process. Due process. The accused have a right to be notified. They have a right to be heard. They have to have their day in court. If it's a crime, they get a jury trial, and so on and so forth. And we don't take away their freedoms, and we don't take away their property, and we don't take away and punish them without due process. There is free speech here. You have the right to say things that people don't like. And heaven knows I hear that every day in the Capitol building, and so do you. But they have a right to say it. They have a right to assemble and to protest the government for a redress of their grievances. Even when you don't like the group. And senators, I'm here to tell you there's a lot of these groups I don't like. But they have a constitutional right to do it. Now, what is happening, in my opinion, and why I brought this bill, is in this country, we have played fast and loose with a definition, a term that we call domestic terrorist. If I were to go around this chamber and ask each of you to define it, I guarantee you I'd get a lot of different responses. And I know that because I've been doing that. I will also tell you that there's nothing in Idaho code that defines it right now. But from a state government standpoint, how do we know what a domestic terrorist unless we look to the federal government? If we go to the federal government, I will tell you the Patriot Act defines it one way. But if you go into the regulations and into the inner workings of the FBI, they say something a little bit different. So you get a feel for it. But what is particularly disturbing about it is that the way the term is being used to, in my opinion, affect the constitutional rights of our citizens. And I mean Idahoans as well. You will remember in recent years that school boards have had some trouble, particularly through the COVID experience that we had. There were parents that were very upset on both sides of the issues. Some that said you have to have masks on every kid, and some said it doesn't make any sense, you don't do that. And often those disagreements would boil over in school board meetings. I've represented a few boards over the years. I've seen stuff boil over. I've had representation agreements where before I even went to the board, they would call me and say, you better bring the police because there's going to be a knockdown drag out here at the board meeting tonight. But the troubling part is that in these instances, the parents complaining at the school board meetings, as rowdy, as obnoxious as they were, were labeled by the government as domestic terrorists. And they were put on a list. They had a little check by their name that said these guys need to be watched. And in some instances, they've been dragged out of places, and you get a feel for it. Here's what you know, senators, is that if you were called a domestic terrorist, it's going to affect your name. It's going to affect your business. It's going to affect your family. And it's not fair if you've never had your due process. You've never had your day in court. You've never had somebody even tell you you're being put on a list. All of a sudden, everybody knows you're on the list. So that's what this bill is trying to remedy in the state of Idaho. The bill creates a definition for domestic terrorist. And the bill says that you don't call someone a domestic terrorist unless they've had their due process. We have libel and slander laws in the United States. If someone went around telling all my neighbors, my friends, my constituents that I was a murderer, and I'd never been tried, and never been accused, and never been anything, they might get a nice little letter from me saying that you better take that back or you're going to be in court. We have libel and slander. We can protect ourselves. And that's what this bill will do also, is to give you the grounds to say, well, first of all, let's talk about what a domestic terrorist is. And secondly, let's make it clear in the law that you don't call somebody something unless they've actually been adjudicated. That's what this bill does. It clarifies the distinction between a terrorist, which is a whole nother ball of wax in terms of definition, and domestic terrorist in Idaho. And it will make sure that we continue to protect the people of Idaho from those groups that are concerning, that have had a reputation of doing wrong things, but we still protect them too, because we stand on this ground. And the ground is, you don't punish someone from the government unless they've been adjudicated. I will challenge you, senators, to think of a terrorist and imagine the terrorist act that you want to imagine in the state of Idaho. A shooting, a bombing, destruction of property, you name it. I'm here to tell you we have a law right now that you can prosecute that person for that crime. You don't need a separate one, you can do it. If someone goes into downtown Boise and shoots 30 people, God forbid, you have 30 convictions on first-degree murder. They're not getting out of prison. So you start to ask, why are we so hell-bent on calling people these names and putting them on lists? I think it's an important question to be asking. Senators, this bill is a good first step towards making sure that in this environment where the labeling of people can cause them to ruin their lives, that we make clear what those labels mean. And we make sure that people's rights are protected when they're labeled. Yeah. And we make sure that the government doesn't have too heavy a hand to be able to label somebody and ruin their lives. With that, Mr. Chairman, debate is open. Mr. President. Is there further debate?
January 6th.
Mr. President.
Senator Winthrop.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as I debate this bill, I want to really reflect on the chaplain's message today, that my intent in the debate is not to belittle or to make any intention about the bill's sponsor at all. My debate is purely about the content of the bill, and I know that it is not anything about any bad intent, as we've heard from the good majority leader. My concern with the bill is that of the definition, well, let me start over, and I'll parallel the discussion of the good majority leader. I hope I'm not breaking rules, but each time the bill has come up, I have voted against it. The reason, and I think is important to understand in my perspective, is because we are now connecting domestic terrorism to a foreign entity. And that we use the word domestic in many policies, domestic water policy, energy policy, etc. And we know that happens within our borders, but also that is about being domestic. And we don't need an international force to have that. The other thing is I'm not aware of any people being labeled domestic terrorists in our state, especially even recently at school board meetings. While some of those media portrayals have been negative and scary, I don't recall ever thinking they were domestic terrorists or anybody calling them that. Even in my time when I served in the body across the rotunda, during a very conflictual time, a group of citizens pushed past the state police, broke doors and glass to make their way into the gallery. Then into my committee room where I felt threatened, and I took a privilege by the chair and left. Even then, I did not call them domestic terrorists. In this building, people have been arrested for doing their peaceful protest to add the word sexual orientation and gender identity. They were never called domestic terrorists. They were arrested. So my concern is that we're now linking this with a foreign entity instead of domestic. And the reason that's important to me is that I love history. And so I did some research on this law. And I wondered what got it here in the first place? Why do we have this law? And I went down to the good research librarians, and they gave me a full folder with the meeting minutes of when the bill was passed, news articles, and so forth. And I didn't realize it, because I didn't live in Idaho at the time, but in the 1980s, there was a bombing of Reverend Wasmuth in northern Idaho, and that was done by was labeled a terrorist group because of the amount of terror it did inflict. And people gathered, and legislation was passed to address that kind of activity. Significant violence meant to intimidate and threaten the reverend. And the discussions at the time were very much about domestic groups that might arise that would create terror in order to influence policy, actions, civilians, and so forth. And when I read that, then it dawned on me, oh, I get it, why we have this statute. If the statute currently is not doing what it needs to do, what I would advise is not to take out the first section about civil disorder, maybe modify it or amend it a bit to really thread that needle. And I would also not link it to a foreign government. In my lifetime, I remember Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and he, over a period of years, sent bombs through the mail to threaten and coerce because he didn't like the advancement of technology. I mean, I'll never forget that. People putting envelopes of anthrax, bombing in Boston. Those, to me, that's what we're talking about, not school board meetings. I understand the bill sponsor's concern, and if that is a concern, I think we could address that differently. But to eliminate the threat of a group of U.S. citizens, Idahoans, that would come together to actually inflict, coerce, intimidate, and harm a military, government, civilian group is a problem. I was researching and reading some articles, and there was an article that I read, was quite fascinating, but it talked about, and if anybody wants to read it, I'm happy to share it, but it talked about the increase in U.S. terrorist attacks against the police force, and noted it was similar percentages from they called far right and far left, and that the U.S. police departments were being terrorized. And that was a huge increase in the last few years. and those are from U.S. citizens. So I feel like we still do need something to capture that. And even in some of the discussions about that original passage of bill, there was a lot of discussion about a message it sends when your state has a law that says this kind of behavior is not tolerated. An organized group of folks using coercion, violence, and threats to intimidate against other U.S. citizens. So I so appreciate the majority leader's intent. I hear him. I've been really trying to wrap my brain around it. It is not about the intent. I'm just concerned about the potential consequence if we remove or completely take that domestic piece and define it as only linking with a foreign entity. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there further debate?
Mr. President, to debate the bill.
Senator Foreman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I, too, fully believe that the bill author's intentions are absolutely solid with this bill. And when I read it, at first glance, I go, okay, it's logical. Maybe we do need to define some of these things just for the sake of clarity. But I'd like to echo the good senator from 19's concerns, because I have the same concerns. We're living in an age where we like to hang names or titles on people. And sometimes that gets done without a lot of thorough concern or thought for what that might do to the person. It's easy, once you're labeled, to sit back and watch your life fall apart. And it's hard to put a stop to it. We have a good body of laws in this state. Title 18, for example, which deals with most of the terrible acts that criminals could or would commit. And it provides penalties for violating the rules of society. I guess I really don't see the need to create terms like terrorist or terrorist organization. If someone who we would call a terrorist goes out and commits the stereotypical acts that a terrorist or terrorist organization would do, our Idaho code covers that already. They're not going to get far in an Idaho court of law. You can't murder people. You can't commit arson. You can't blow up buildings. Whether or not we hang the moniker terrorist on them, to me, is mock snicks. What difference does that make? They should get due process, and they will in Idaho, but the result will be the same whether we call them terrorists or not. They broke the law, and they'd be punished. Again, good intent here, and one could argue it's a logical approach to this issue, but I just have concerns that, number one, the designation, the name, the moniker, terrorist, could be misapplied. And I really think we're well covered with our good body of laws to make this unnecessary. So be voting no on the bill.
Thank you.
Mr. President,
Senator Rutke,
to debate against the bill.
you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll try to keep this brief just because I think we've covered the issues, but I struggled with this bill, and I just thought I'd explain why, and maybe that helps somebody as you get ready to vote. Maybe it doesn't. I feel like I understand why the gentleman from District 27 brought the bill. Maybe this is a little different twist on it, but if you haven't noticed, our politics are getting coarser, uglier. People are more aggressive. That's not a hot take. I think everybody realizes that. And I can tell you one thing that does not bring the temperature down is to call your opponent in that argument a terrorist. It's not helpful. It doesn't make things better. It doesn't advance a conversation. So I understand the desire to define terrorism, to make sure it's used appropriately. Democracy is messy, And, you know, one person's good argument is another person's obnoxious argument. And people do get out of hand at school board meetings, city council meetings, you know, when talking to teachers, when expressing First Amendment rights generally. That's democracy. It's going to be that way. Hopefully, as a society, we can agree upon and behave in a way that is consistent with the mores of our communities. We can treat people well and respectfully and have these discussions and debates, even if occasionally we get passionate about it. And I wouldn't want to see an overzealous prosecutor charge somebody as, you know, a domestic terrorist when all they were doing was expressing First Amendment rights. But the gentleman from District 27 asked a question. He said, well, why are we so bent on calling people domestic terrorists? And the answer to that is because some people are domestic terrorists. Timothy McVeigh, Ted Kaczynski, the gentleman from North Idaho who used a bomb to try to intimidate and harm Reverend Bill Wasmuth. Those events, by the way, in North Idaho were the reasons that we have this statute in the first place. There are just some behaviors that are so beyond the pale that use violence or threats of violence to affect the public policy of the state of Idaho. And we have to have something like that. We have to have a public policy statement that says that is against the law and it will be punished in a different way. And you will be categorized as a different type of criminal. That's what this law was set forth to do back in the 80s. And so my concern is that what we've done is we've now said, well, if you're a domestic terrorist, in order to be a domestic terrorist, you have to have a connection with a foreign government. Well, Ted Kaczynski did not have a connection with a foreign government. Timothy McVeigh did not have a connection with a foreign government. And those Aryan Nation members who bombed Reverend Bill Wasmuth did not have a connection with a foreign government. So they would not, under this bill, be a domestic terrorist. They would be somebody who damaged property, I suppose, or committed some other crime, but it would fall under the category of things that people do. So those are the reasons I'll be voting against the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Is there further debate?
Mr. President,
Senator Lanning,
to debate the bill,
you have the floor.
in my non-senator job, I'm a marketer, and there's a saying, you know, with marketing, when we're looking at data and KPIs, like key performance indicators, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So if you're looking at a marketing campaign, well, how do we know if this is working or not? If we don't have KPIs in place, we don't know what levers to pull to improve it. And I know that applies to other industries other than marketing. So listening to this debate and reading this bill and being somewhat familiar with it and having some conversations about it, I think it is a good thing, and I want to commend the senator from District 27 for bringing it up, because what it does, in the same way as I was talking about data, it defines what a domestic terrorist is, because if we don't define it, how can we then use that term? And if we don't define it, who gets to determine what intimidation means? And some of these terms are kind of vague. So what this bill does, the big change I've seen, and that was already referenced, is it says if someone is to be labeled and prosecuted as a domestic terrorist, they have to be tied to an FTO, to a foreign terrorist organization. That kind of makes sense to me, because we're putting sideboards on it and saying you have to have this and this, otherwise you're not a domestic terrorist.
January 6th,
Otherwise,
buddy.
we see what was already referenced on the floor earlier. You know, the National School Board Association, the White House, the AG were calling parents domestic terrorists, which was shameful, by the way, in my opinion. So I like this bill. I think it's a good step in the right direction. And I encourage you to vote yes.
January 6th insurrection wasn't domestic terrorists, is what you're saying?
Mr. President,
Senator Hart.
would
It was
the
only a foreign
bill sponsor
nation?
yield to a question?
Senator Anton, will you yield to a question?
Yes, I will, Mr.
Senator
President.
yields.
Thank you, Mr. President. Gentleman from 27, you mentioned libel and slander in your opening debate, and libel and slander, based on the Sullivan decision of the Supreme Court, applies differently to public figures. So my question is, would your legislation apply differently to public figures, or does that embrace everyone, including the people in this room?
Senator Anton?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good Senator. The reference to the libel and slander cases was to be illustrated, but the answer to your question is this would not provide a different standard for someone who is a public figure. It would be the same criminal standard.
Thank you. Mr. President, to debate the bill?
You have the floor to debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. I agree with all the opening remarks of the gentleman from 27. I think this is timely. I think there's a real concern. And I also think that this goes outside of the normal politics that we've experienced, and that we've seen government entities use this term not for prosecution but for political ends. And I think it is a very good idea that we put sideboards on this and that we protect the public from what the gentleman said in his opening remarks, penalties that affect you where you have not had due process.
White
So thank
supremacy in northern
Thank
Idaho.
you.
Read out news.
Is there further debate? Hearing Senator Nichols,
Mr. President, to debate the bill.
you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I like what has been said so far. As someone that has gone back to speak with the Weaponization Committee back in D.C. and talking to numerous people that have been labeled in one way or another without due process as domestic terrorists by either the media or people in the public, this is a timely bill. This narrows and specifies definitions, and that is something that we are needing right now because we need to be protecting people from being labeled wrongly without due process. We have federal government entities that are using third-party, mainly NGOs, that have already labeled people as such. And so those are being utilized now to continue perpetuating labeling upon people that have not been convicted of being a domestic terrorist. We have people in our own state that the only thing that saved them was from being labeled a link to an FTO. And if they had been linked to that FTO in any way, shape, or form, then they could have been prosecuted as a domestic terrorist. So for this point in time, for this period of time, without Idaho having the definitions that we are needing, we do not want to be relying on the federal definitions. We need to be maintaining what we have here as a sovereign
States
state
government,
to
Ms.
be able to
Nichols.
protect people and to be able to make sure that
Bird Society.
domestic, the usage of the term domestic terrorist is not being thrown out like candy at a parade. As it was already brought up, yes, we have had parents that were that were labeled, and the FBI and DOJ were asked to investigate those parents as domestic terrorists. These parents were simply just raising questions in regards to their concerns at local school board meetings. And we do see the media utilizing terms for the average American for merely participating in the political process. This can have deadly consequences, and we want to make sure that we are protecting our citizens here in Idaho. So I appreciate the work that has been done on this bill, and we'll be voting yes on this.
Sure you will.
Is there further debate? Hearing none, Senator Anton, you're recognized to close the debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senators, I know we're late on time, but I do want to respond to a few things. I appreciate very much the good Senator Ann, because she's pointed something out that's a truth that I think was a disagreement on the floor here. That nobody's been blamed. This hasn't happened to anybody for going to the school board meeting. Members of the Senate, with permission of the President, may I refer to a May 11, 2022 letter written by the ranking members of the House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary from the United States Congress to the Honorable Merrick B. Garland, the Attorney General of the United States.
Having cited the source, the senator may read
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me tell you what happened after, as was referenced on the floor, a letter came from the National School Boards Association to the Attorney General of the United States. Some interesting things happened within a week. There was a letter sent out to all of the FBI offices. We're having a problem with the school boards.
Yep,
We got to do something about it.
yep.
A hotline was set up. You could report your neighbors and your friends for being domestic terrorists. And to say that nobody was reported is not accurate. I will tell you that in this letter, of a couple of examples, and by the way, some of these calls came out of Idaho.
Yeah,
So to
Ted
say it's not
Bundy.
happening in Idaho is not accurate. In one investigation, there was a complaint made to the National Threat Operations Center. A national threat. Let me tell you what the national threat was.
Oh,
There's a
here we go.
right-wing moms group known as Moms for Liberty. Now, I don't know this group.
Yeah, they are.
I don't even know if they're in Idaho.
Yeah, they are.
A right-wing moms group known as Moms for Liberty, and she's a gun owner. There was the threat. FBI went to talk to her. Possible domestic terrorist.
Oh, no.
What crime had she committed? There was
Moms
no
for
crime.
Liberty, is that, and it is a anti-government.
Let me tell you about another one. Same letter. We've got a guy here who fits the profile of an insurrectionist because he rails against the government, he believes all these conspiracy theories, he has a lot of guns, and he's going to threaten to use them.
There's 11 organizations in Idaho.
Well, they went and talked to that guy too, but you get a feel for this. I can go on and on. Senators, it has happened.
Yep.
And it's frightening to think that without even a definition, without due process, you get tagged. They had a special tag for these folks. Let me tell you what it was. Edu officials, EDOFFICIALS, the FBI threat tag for parents who are showing up at school board meetings and disagreeing.
Yeah.
And I grant you, they might have even committed a crime.
Yep, threatened them.
Ted Kaczynski, were we unable to prosecute him? If, however
He's from
the
Montana.
facts played out. Timothy McVeigh, we weren't able to do anything about him. The law wasn't strong enough.
That was Oklahoma.
No, that's ridiculous. Of course we were able to. Lastly, Senators, there was some, I think, very thoughtful. It's always very good debate and thoughtful. I appreciate everyone who testified or who spent their time on the floor today. Senator from 19, our minority leader, I'm always willing to work with her sincerely to tighten up what we have to do here in Idaho to make sure that these kinds of violent things don't happen. I believe that during the course of the debate, there was reference to the need that we have in our law a statement that this kind of behavior is not tolerated. Well, Senators, you have to love my bill. Let me refer you to the very first page of the bill, 18-8101. It says, the legislature further recognizes and finds that conspiracies and training activities in further of unlawful acts of terrorism, I added that part, and violence against persons and property is not constitutionally protected, poses a threat to the public order and safety, and should be subject to criminal sanction. We have a statement. We don't support this kind of thing in Idaho. And to say that if you support this bill, you support it is what we call cow manure at home. And with that, Mr. President, debate is closed.
Debate is
21,
closed. The question before the Senate is,
anti-government
shall Senate Bill
groups in
1220
Idaho.
pass the Senate? The Secretary will call the roll.
Adams. Anthem.
Aye.
Burned. Bierke. Burtonshaw. Carlson. Cook. Den Hartog. Egbert. Foreman. Grow. Guthrie. Harris. Hart. Hartkin. Herndon. Just. Lakey. Lee. Lenny. Lend. Nichols. Okonowitz. Robbie. Ricks. Ruckty.
Senator from 29 votes no.
Schroeder. Taylor. Taves. Trakel. Van Orden. Ordingle King. Winder. Wintro. Seiderveld.
Party line except for one.
The vote count shows 27 in favor with 8 opposed. The majority having voted in the affirmative. Senate Bill 1220 has passed the Senate. Hearing no correction of title, the title is approved, and the bill will be transmitted to the House of Representatives.